guys, and welcome to A Push with Lennox. And today we're coming to you live from the Death Star, where we're going to be talking about the American progressive movement. That's right, the progressive movement, which went from about 1890 to 1912. And it's during this time that we're going to see the American reaction to the Gilded Age. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as normal, we always start with our vocabulary, our terminology. And like I've always said, to understand history, you've got to understand the terminology. So I want you to take a minute, go ahead, look through these words and make sure you know them all, because all of these play a key role in the progressive movement. Now, as we move into the progressive movement, what I want you to understand is kind of the why it happened, what happened, and how it happened. So the why is basically coming out of the Gilded Age. We're just finishing up this time period of industrialization and urbanization, as well as this huge wave of immigration that's coming into our country. And so as that happens, a lot of changes start to happen in America. Now, what happened during the progressive age was the government tried to start to regulate some of these new movements, and in that they're trying to improve society. The first thing they're going to do on the business side is they're going to reject this idea of laissez-faire ideology. Now, I don't want you to think that all of a sudden our government is switching from capitalism to a new form of socialism. In fact, socialism was completely rejected during this time period. Actually, what they want to do is improve capitalism. They see the benefits of it, but they also see some of the pitfalls of it. And so now they're going to look at what can we do to get involved to prop up capitalism, keep it going, but also keep our society safe. So who was involved in this? There were a lot of different groups who were involved in the progressive movement, and it was a diverse group. You had church leaders and politicians, the unions were there, women, African Americans, and all of them had their own goals during this time. For instance, when you looked at church leaders, they were the driving force behind the temperance movement. Politicians were looking at how powerful monopolies had become in America, so they're looking at trying to slow their growth down. Unions, as always, are looking out for workers' rights. During the Gilded Age, unions were seen as a threat to American society. We'll see if that changes during the progressive era. Women still fighting for that right to vote, although we saw during the Gilded Age that women had a new role that they played as they're gaining more and more independence in the workplace. As that happens, they're going to be driven to get even more rights, and that vote is number one on their wish list. And finally, African Americans still fighting for equality. Coming out of the 1890s, Plessy versus Ferguson had determined that separate but equal was good, but we know it wasn't. And so African Americans are going to be starting to fight for this. Now, when you look at the progressive era, sometimes it's good to compare it to other eras in our history. And the ones that I would pick out when thinking of the progressives, I'd look back to the age of Jackson, because that was the first real reform movement we had in our country. And the progressive movement of the 1910s absolutely compares to the reform movement of the 1830s. Think about the populist movement during the 1890s and what they were trying to change. They were trying to improve society, and also look forward to the New Deal. Again, similar ideas flowing throughout all of these different movements. Now, when we look at some of the people that were involved, we have to talk about the Muckrakers. The Muckrakers are a group of people who were trying to expose the problems in American society. Actually, they got their name from Teddy Roosevelt. Now, some of the Muckrakers you need to know is Ida Tarbell, Jacob Riis, and Lincoln Stevens. Ida Tarbell is famous for writing her book or article, The History of the Standard Oil Company. This was published in McClure magazine in 1902, where she basically puts a spotlight on J.D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil, and looks at how that monopoly had become too powerful. Jacob Riis and How the Other Half Lives is going to expose the horrors of life in the slums in New York. And he's going to create this photo expose of what it looked like, kind of bringing to light how people were living. Lincoln Stevens is going to introduce The Shame of the Cities in 1904, where he's going to not only just look at life in the slums, but he's going to look at the political corruption and the power that these political machines had. Another book that came out during this time was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Now, Muckrakers, someone asked me before, Do we have muckrakers today? And we absolutely do, except they have a different title. We call these folks whistleblowers today. Same idea. They're trying to expose corruption in different parts of our society. Next, we want to talk about women, the role of women in the progressive movement, and they played a huge role. It's during this time period that they're starting to break down those, what we call those separate spheres of existence. Remember, the women were under that umbrella of the cult of domesticity, which said the women's sphere of influence was in the home, and women were expected to influence their family, positively during this time period. Well, now we're seeing that sphere starting to expand. It's starting to go out into society from beyond the four walls of their home. And we'll see different groups form. For example, the National Child Labor Committee will fight for laws that ban child labor. We still had children working in the factories and stuff, and women are going to be at the forefront of bringing that to an end. The National Consumers League was headed up by Florence Kelley. Now, they're going to advocate for the rights of women in the workplace. They are also going to fight against child labor as well. So you kind of see that crossover of different leagues and different committees. A Supreme Court case you should be familiar with is Mueller versus Oregon. In this case, the court ruled that it was completely constitutional to protect women on the workplace, as well as limit them to a 10-hour workday. Now, one major event that happens during this time that women are part of is going to be the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This is going to lead to the death of 146 workers, and it's going to put the spotlight on the absolute danger of some of the workplaces that was existing. For instance, there were no fire escapes. There was no, they had doors locked from the outside in the workplace. And so the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is going to bring attention to safety in the workplace. Now, it's not essentially a women's rights movement, but because women were involved and because women were killed, and we saw the pictures of women who had jumped from the building and laying on the sidewalk and stuff, that brought a lot more attention to the problem, and it probably accelerated safety in the workplace. So just keep that in mind. Let's talk about urban reform, the reform of cities and how they're going to run. A lot of problems existed in the cities at this time, specifically the poverty in the slums. There was a lot of political corruption, and there was a lot of alcoholism. Now, some people on their own take to fighting this. You saw Jane Addams and Florence Kelley with the Settlement House. You saw the social gospel movement trying to do their role in all of this. But what's going to end up happening is that the people are going to start demanding that power is taken away from some of these political bosses in these cities. And meaning that the one thing that the bosses could control was utilities. And they used to put their own people in the utility departments and stuff like that. So what we're going to see happen is people are going to start calling for public utilities to be under the control of the public or the municipal governments. And what we'll see happen is very quickly that municipal governments are going to be reformed, and now people are going to have the power to vote in heads of departments like the city police chief or the fire chief, or I'm thinking of county leaders and stuff like that. You're giving the people more of a voice in who's going to run these organizations. A new idea that's going to be introduced during this time is what's known as the Wisconsin idea. And this grew out of the threat that a lot of people felt of the corporations taking control of the states. Now, Robert La Follette is going to pioneer a lot of these reforms. He's going to put it in place in the state of Wisconsin. That's why it's called the Wisconsin idea. And La Follette believed that he should surround himself with experts in different fields of necessity for state governing. They're going to, under the Wisconsin idea, start regulating the public utilities. They're primarily going to be focused on the railroad and the power the railroads had over states. So they're going to start, regulating public utilities, but then they're going to take on the railroad industry. And they're going to start adapting certain tax reforms and political reforms, like I said, where they're going to bring in experts in the field to challenge the corporations and say the corporations aren't going to run the state. These experts in state government will do it instead. Now, one of the biggest successes of the Wisconsin idea is going to be the workers' compensation program. And we'll see an excellent example of that in Wisconsin at this time. Political reform is going to take shape during this time as well. Now, we've talked about municipal at the city level, and then we talked about like the Wisconsin idea at the state level. Now let's talk about it at the national level. One of the very first things that reformers wanted to see was more democracy and reduce the control of the monopolies. The one way they were able to do this is with the Australian or secret ballot. This is going to allow voters to vote in secret. You're not going to know who they voted for. This was something new. You know, a lot of these political machines locally had power because they saw who people were voting for. So if you didn't vote the party line, that could be held against you and you risk losing a job or something like that. So the secret ballot will play a key role in reforming that idea. The direct primary. We're going to see the nomination of candidates now in a primary, and people will be able to vote in the primary for the candidate they want to represent them. It used to be the political machines or the political party who chose the candidate. Now it's the people. And then we go through a system of initiative, referendum, and recall votes. These are votes that are specifically in the hands of the people. For example, a recall vote allows voters to basically remove a politician from office before his or her term is over if they deem they're not doing the job. They can recall or have a vote to say, you're out. An initiative. Voters could actually or can actually introduce new laws to our law books, and through a series of petitions, people can initiate the idea of a new law. They can get enough signatures on a petition where that law is then placed on the ballot, and then the people vote for it. But it all starts with the people. And finally, a referendum, same kind of idea as an initiative, except the law is introduced by lawmakers, but then the people vote on it. A lot of taxes today are voted on by referendum. So you'll see that school boards will have bond elections where people will vote whether or not they want to pay for a bond for a school district. So that's kind of how a referendum works. So, like I said, recall, you can vote someone out. You're out of here. Tribe has spoken. Initiative, voters, introduce laws and vote them in. And then referendum, politicians introduce laws, but the voters still vote them all in. The 17th Amendment is going to come out this time too, and this is when we're going to give voters the direct election of senators. Up until this point, state legislators voted for who would be the U.S. senators from each state. Now the American people from each state can vote for their senators. All of these increase democratic power of the people. And all of these were ideas of the Populist Party. So even though the Populist Party didn't go beyond the Gilded Age, their ideas lived on. So keep that in mind. Temperance movement during this time. Now, we've seen the temperance movement before. We saw it in the 1830s. And the idea was to either reduce the amount of alcohol usage or get rid of it completely. Now, there was some division amongst those who supported the temperance movement. You had those who believed in reducing alcohol, but they were against temperance. We called those the wet supporters. We don't want to prohibit alcohol. We want people to make that choice and help them make that choice. The dry supporters said, no, we're just going to take alcohol away, just end it completely. There was also conflict between those, the native-born Americans and the new immigrants. New immigrants are coming from Eastern European, Italy, Russia, and they did not want prohibition. It's the native-born, the nativists who want prohibition to end alcohol. A lot of that was because they tied abuse of alcohol to some of these people coming in. And then you had the rural versus urban argument. Now remember, you had a lot of corruption, a lot of problems in the urban setting, and alcoholism was one of them. That's why prohibition was supported by people who lived in the cities. Those who lived out in the counties on farms and everything like that, or small towns, they did not support prohibition at all. Two major groups that arose during this time is going to be the women's Christian temperance movement, that they advocated for temperance, reducing the amount of alcohol intake. But the Anti-Saloon League said, no, we got to take it farther. They advocated for legal prohibition, and they're going to get their way. In 1919, the 18th Amendment is going to be passed, which made alcohol in America illegal. And then you'll see the Volstead Act follow that up. That says that you can't produce alcohol, you can't sell alcohol, and you can't transport alcohol. So that all is a part of the temperance movement. Let's talk about my guy, Teddy Roosevelt, TR. TR is going to come into the presidency following the assassination of McKinley, and he believes in an enlarged role for the president. And he has seen examples of this in the past, specifically with labor relations. We saw Rutherford B. Hayes had, his dealings with the Great Railroad Strike in 77, when he called out federal troops to put that strike down. Grover Cleveland dealt with the Pullman strike of 1894, also using federal troops to put that strike down. TR is going to come in, and what he's going to have to deal with is the coal miners' strike in 1902. Now, initially, there wasn't much concern because we had a lot of reserves of coal. But as time went on, those reserves went down, and winter was coming. Now, TR tried to act as a mediator between the owners and the coal miners, but they couldn't come up to an agreement. So he threatened a federal takeover of the coal mines, saying, if you guys don't get it together, I'm taking over. Well, lo and behold, they're able to come up with a compromise, and a crisis is averted. But once again, we have an example of the executive branch stepping into an area which technically is not designated to them under the Constitution. But because of, presidential executive power, they use that at times to step in under the umbrella of national security. Okay. Roosevelt is going to, coming out of the negotiations of the coal miner strike, is going to introduce what he calls the square deal for America. We refer to it as the 3 C's: the controlling corruption in the corporations, consumer protection, and finally conservation. And we're going to look at each of these C's here real quickly. The first C is to stop the corruption in corporations. This is the time period that Roosevelt is going to become known as the Great Trust Buster. Now, he is going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, initially, the Sherman Antitrust Act was a weak piece of legislation. In fact, it was mostly used to fight against labor unions. But TR is going to use it to break up the Northern Securities Company, which was a railroad monopoly. And when he does that, he's going to be challenged at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to fully support TR and what he did using the Sherman Antitrust Act. And that's when he's going to become known as the Trust Buster. Now, TR was very good at distinguishing between good and bad trust. Said good trust exists, and these are the trusts that were run efficiently and they kept prices low. He didn't have a problem with those, but it was the monopolies and trusts that he said hurt the consumers, that stifled competition in a capitalistic society. Those are the ones he's going to target. Those are the trusts he is going to try to bust. He's going to increase the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and doing that with both the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act. Both of these are dealing with, again, the railroad monopolies. The Elkins Act of 1903 is going to increase penalties for those railroads that are still offering rebates. Remember, a rebate is something that a company pays to a consumer or a client, in which I come in and I buy a whole lot of stuff, and once I fulfill my promise to buy all this, you are going to rebate or give me back some of my money. And a lot of times rebates at that time in the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era were used as backroom deals to secure business for a railroad. But those rebates became, threatening to lower, to small business and stuff like that. So what we're going to see is the Elkins Act is going to increase the penalties if you are actually issuing rebates. The Hepburn Act is going to give the Interstate Commerce Commission the power now to set maximum rates on railroads. Now, remember, the Interstate Commerce Act actually made railroads publish their rates. The Hepburn Act is going to put a ceiling on those rates, that they can't charge more than this specific amount. Okay? Ooh, we got through that one. All right, let's talk about consumer protections. Now, there were hardly any protections for consumers coming out of the Gilded Age, but that's all going to change when Upton Sinclair introduces his book, The Jungle. Now, his goal with this book was to increase support for socialism and workers' rights. But once he went into the meatpacking factories, he saw what was going on, and he is going to bring an eye-opening experience to the public to see the unsanitary nature of the meat industry during this time period. And the public is going to cry out for the government to do something. And so TR and the government in 1906 is going to pass the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Meat Inspection Act basically set guidelines for how meat is going to be processed, and then how it would be inspected as well to make sure we didn't get any of those rat droppings in our food anymore. And then finally, the Pure Food and Drug Act is going to create a system of labeling food and drugs for America. So they're going to set laws that protect the consumer not only from the manufacturing and sale of these goods, but also making sure that companies are labeling their products correctly. Finally, let's talk about the last C, and that's conservation. Now, TR was a huge outdoorsman. He was a hunter. He loved being in the outdoors. And, you know, he saw the value of the lands that we had in America. Now, the Sierra Club had already been in existence, and they had always been there to advocate for our environment. So TR is going to come in, you know, as president, and he is going to use a law that was passed in 1891 called the Forest Reserve Act. And he's going to use that to protect 150 million acres of federal land. Some of that land is going to become national parks. Some of it's going to become national forests. He's also going to use the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902. What that allowed the government to do was take money they made from the sale of public lands and use it to build an irrigation project in the West to help out with agriculture. Now, conservationism is one of the longest lasting legacies of TR's presidency. But I don't want you to confuse conservation with preservation. There in this picture there, you see TR on the left standing next to a man by the name of John Muir. John Muir was brought into TR's government to help him with this conservation effort. The problem was Muir was a preservationist. A preservationist wants to preserve the land as it is. A conservationist wants to conserve the land and get the best use out of it without overusing it. And so there's going to be conflicts as we move forward. Initially, TR and Muir got along just fine. It's going to be when the next president comes in that there's a problem. That president is William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft is going to be the hand-selected successor to TR to the presidency. TR followed Washington's example and served only 2 terms, saying he would not run again. When Taft comes in, he's going to keep a lot of the progressive policies that TR had put in place, and he's going to continue on, and that's what TR hoped for. But what's interesting is, in doing that, Taft is going to actually break up more trust than TR ever did, and he's going to continue those conservation policies. However, with regards to conservation, he's going to conflict with Muir, who wanted to preserve the land, and he's going to end up firing John Muir. Well, that's going to upset TR and start getting his blood boiling a little bit. Then when we see Taft's foreign policy come in, dollar diplomacy, he's kind of veering away a little bit from TR's big stick diplomacy, and he's going to do things, his way now. That's not what TR expected. And so when Taft starts bringing in some of his own policies, and maybe that overshadowed some of TR's policies, that's when TR is going to try to come back. And we're going to see a third party come into the election of 1912. And that election is going to shake up things, and it's going to become the foundational stone for what we compare a lot of elections with in the future, especially when third party candidates are introduced. All right, guys. So that's the progressive era, and hopefully you got a little bit more knowledge, historical knowledge going on around in your head. Coming up in our next video where we're talking about imperialism. Happens during the exact same time period, but it has a completely different goal. So until then, I hope you guys keep learning, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.